What's up guys, Tucker here from Electric Cycle Rider. Behind me I've got my KTM Freeride EXC and the pre-production Surron Storm Bee. Finally, we have a couple of bikes that are really similar in this category. If you look at the specifications on paper, they're very similar bikes. Their intention is really similar and their price point is also really similar.
Yeah, so about that price point comment. When I recorded this video, this Surron Storm was a pre-production model, and it was implied that this bike would be in the $10,500 range, which would put it right in the KTM Freeride territory. Time will tell for the street-legal version of the Storm Bee, but the off-road specific Storm Bee F was announced to have an impressive MSRP of $8,499, so that might set the stage for the rest of this review. Speaking of which, let's get back to it.
I thought it would be a good opportunity to ride these bikes back to back, talk about some of their key differences and their similarities, hopefully help you guys make a decision on which bike of these is best for you if you're on the fence about it.
The KTM Freeride EXC has a nominal power output of 9 kilowatts and a peak power output of 18 kilowatts. It's got a removable 3.9 kilowatt hour battery, and it's suspended by a WP XPLOR 43mm fork and a WP PDS shock. The Freeride weighs 245 pounds and recently had a price increase from $10,499 to $11,299. The Surron Storm Bee has a nominal power of 10 kilowatts and a peak output of 22.5 kilowatts. It's got a removable 5.7 kilowatt hour battery, and it's suspended by a FastAce fork and shock. The Storm tested here weighs 291 pounds, with the F version weighing 280 pounds. The Storm Bee F will MSRP at $8,499. Both bikes can be found for sale on the ECR Marketplace, where we've compiled listings for all the best dealers who sell electric dirt bikes. I usually save all of my thoughts for the end of the video, but these comparison videos can sometimes get really long. I know that a lot of you are diehard enthusiasts that want all the details, but I also understand that some of you just want the quick info and to get on with your day. So, I'm going to give you the cliff notes in the beginning on this one. If you care to see me expand on these thoughts, you want to see battery range tests, and hear about the nuances of these two bikes, then keep watching. But if you want to know what my quick thoughts are, it's this. The Surron Storm is the more affordable option by about $2,800. It's got a higher top speed of approximately 70 miles per hour, and it's more comfortable if you're looking for a mellow riding experience. It feels more relaxed than it does sporty. The suspension is plush and soft, which is why I keep comparing it to a Suzuki DRZ or a Honda XR Internal Combustion bike. Out of the two bikes, the Storm is heavier by about 45 pounds, and that, paired with the softer suspension, can be noticeable if you start pushing the bike hard. Surron claims a seat height of 37 inches, but my test bike was sitting much lower than that thanks to a super low-cut seat. This is great for standover height, but it feels a little awkward when you're sitting down. According to my tape measure, it's got a ground clearance of roughly 11.75 inches, which comes in approximately 3.5 inches lower than the KTM. The Storm has a better LCD display and a lot more programmable features than the KTM. The Storm utilizes a 110-volt charger, which is more convenient for charging options, but it also means that recharging the battery takes significantly longer. Oh yeah, it's also got reverse and turbo mode. The KTM Freeride is more expensive, coming in at a current MSRP of $11,299. It's got a lower top speed than the Storm, coming in at approximately 48 miles per hour. What it lacks in comfort when compared to the Storm, it makes up for with a more sporty and nimble feel. A quick translation is that it feels like you're riding on top of the bike rather than in the bike. Although the WP suspension is smaller in size than the FastAce equipment found on the Storm, it has superior performance off-road. According to my tape measure, The KTM has a higher foot peg and a higher ground clearance by about 3.5 inches. It weighs roughly 45 pounds less than the Storm, which is noticeable when you're riding. The throttle mapping and power delivery feels more refined, and it has better rear wheel connection than the Storm. It utilizes a 220 volt charger, which can make recharging somewhat inconvenient, but the upside is that battery charges are significantly quicker when you have access to 220 power. Want to hear more about both bikes? I thought so. Let's get into the full review.
All right, so startup procedure on the Surron Storm. You've got your key here. Just turn that. And you've got your battery indicator here showing me 100%. And if you want to change modes, which there are a bunch of them, you dive into this menu here, holding these two buttons down, and then you can toggle them. So that's B2, E2, A2, P0, C0, F1, T0, X0. So I'm going to run through in voiceover what that all means right now before we get going.
B0 through 5 represents the brake energy regenerative system, which allows for energy to be fed back to the battery when braking. E0 through 5 represents the slide energy regenerative feature, which basically translates to the amount of engine braking or regen when you lay off the throttle. A1 through 3 represents ASR or traction control. P0 or 1 represents the e-brake feature, which you'll want to shut off during off-road riding. C0 or 1 represents tilt protection, also a feature you'll want to shut off during off-road riding. F represents a reserve feature that should ultimately be an option for throttle sensitivity on the production model bike. T represents an option for updating the firmware, and X represents exiting out of the feature menu.
So once you have all of your settings set, I'm riding the settings that I currently prefer. I've run a bunch of them, and I'll explain kind of what I think about all the different ones. But anyways, all you got to do is tap the front brake lever here, and then you'll see ready. Ready means ready, so let's go. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm also in sport mode here. You've got Eco, Rain, and Sport, but I'm going to ride it in Sport. Oh man, that is deep right now. Whew. Yes, the feet are wet. Alright, so just to preface before we get into this ride too much, I'm going to ride at what I will call a brisk pace, at least for me. Out here, I'm not going to be riding as fast as possible. I'm doing that just for range purposes, just don't want to rip on the bike too hard. I've already done that, and I can talk about what that feels like, but I think it's in the best interest for both bikes, especially the Storm, to ride it at a little bit slower of a pace. The Storm is a trail bike, no doubt. But right off the bat, I will say it's geared a little bit more towards a dual sport than it is like a hard single track bike, in my opinion. And a lot of that feels due to the suspension. Like, I feel like if I'm trying to push this bike really hard the way that it's set up stock, it feels a little sketchy just because it's really soft. And I have stiffened the suspension up a bit to compensate for that, but I would say it's set up for comfort over speed right now. And so I'm gonna ride it like that. So one thing to point out, something I'm noticing already on my ride, is I'm clipping the pegs and bottoming out a little bit. And that's one big thing to note on this bike is the ground clearance.
My tape measure says the Storm Bee has a ground clearance of 11.75 inches.
So what that means when you're riding it is, yeah, you gotta kind of be careful. So I've bottomed this thing out plenty of times already. One thing I'd like to point out about the bike is the weight. Like, it doesn't ride like a heavy bike, but it definitely doesn't ride like a light bike. And I've made this comparison already, so I'll do it again, but this bike really reminds me of like a Suzuki DRZ. It reminds me of kind of like a Honda XR in some regards. It's just like kind of a softer, more mild trail bike. A little less performance oriented. It's still got a lot more performance than those bikes that I just mentioned in terms of power. See, there you go, I just bottomed out. I don't know if you heard that, but anyways, back to power. The performance is definitely nice. It's got lots of good power, good acceleration, so better than those bikes in that regard, but when it comes to the chassis and the suspension, kind of the overall feel of the bike, yeah, it's got that kind of like mellow, soft trail bike kind of feel. Big rock. So good and bad depending on who you are. I mean, it's comfortable. Like when you're not riding the bike at a high rate of speed, it's comfortable. It's not too harsh. When you do ride it faster, I feel like I get kicked around a lot more though. Bike seems to buck a lot in the rear. It's kind of an interesting shock orientation. It's like basically vertical. It's FastAce suspension. I don't have a ton of experience with it. While we're on the subject of power, I think it's important to note some top speed on the Storm. The bike definitely pulls harder and longer than the KTM Freeride. Once you reach that like 40 mile per hour-ish speed on the KTM, the bike really signs off and reaches its maximum, whereas the Storm continues to pull. So it's got a much higher top speed. Talking top speed as I'm going 10 miles an hour. But anyways, it's the right time to talk about it. The ergos of the bike are really good. I would personally like a bar bend with maybe a little bit less sweep to it, but it's comfortable. If you want to compare it to Surron's other model, the Light BX, it's definitely a full-size bike. But we're going to compare it to the Freeride. So it is, let's just say it's a larger bike than the KTM Freeride, but the seat is a little funky on this bike. You can see it in the photos and the videos of the bike profile, but got like a banana kind of dip going on the seat. You really sit in the bike when you sit down, which I find to be a little awkward, but the upside to it is if you're needing to dab a foot or stand over height, it's, you know, easier if you're shorter. You can touch the ground easier. This is the stuff right here where I think the Surron Storm is most at home. Going 45 miles an hour on a 2-track kind of road. And it feels like this is what the bike was designed for, in my opinion. But it does handle stuff like that really well too. Little log jumps and drops. So the features of the Storm are pretty cool, especially when it comes to how much you can customize it. You can customize regen, both just, you know, when you lay off the throttle, but also when you brake, which I think is one of the cooler features of the Storm, is the ability to regen a bit while you're braking. And just having the flexibility to kind of set your own parameters for that. Power modes and traction control. Another really cool feature. I didn't think I would want traction control, but the more I've been messing around with it on this bike, the more I realized that, you know, with these electric bikes, you don't have like a clutch to modulate some of that power and traction. And so traction control is actually really useful. I have been liking it more than I thought on this bike. Just helps to get power to the ground and not spin the rear wheel so much. And that propels you forward. So that's pretty cool, and that's something that the KTM has very little, at least options-wise. Man, we got some gnarly rain up here, and this stuff is so loose and washed out. Yeah, I find the traction control to be very useful on this bike. And it's really nice to be able to select different settings in regards to that, where the KTM has very little flexibility on that front. All right, guys, just checked my GoPro and saw that about the last 30 minutes of my ride did not get recorded because the GoPro froze again. I think I'm done with this Hero 10. And what you missed was turbo mode on here. So luckily I have some audio of that, so I might just roll that. So you hit this button here. Oh man, it's kind of hard to use. Woo! But yeah, it engages a bit more power, so I felt it there. I don't know what the application is you would use it for, but it's, yeah, I don't know. It's something. These are two little, what I thought were gimmicky. I will say the turbo mode still is kind of gimmicky. You just, yes, it gives you a bit more power when this T is illuminated. You can hit that while you're riding and it gives you a little bit of a boost. I don't ever see myself using that, but what I would see myself using, and something that I laughed at in the beginning when I first saw the Spike, is this reverse mode. So you hold that in, that flashes R, and the bike has reverse. And it seems kind of silly when you just think about it, but I've actually used it quite a bit. I'll try to demonstrate a little bit, but it's like, you know, say maybe you're stuck up against a log right up here and you're trying to wiggle your bike out of it. Well, you can just kind of hold that reverse down. Some situation like that is actually something that I've legitimately used it for.
I find the brakes on the Storm Bee to actually outperform those on the KTM. On paper, the Brembos on the KTM should be better than the unbranded brakes on the Storm, but I did not find that to be the case. The KTM utilizes super mini-sized brakes, and I've always felt that to be a weak point on the Freeride. So much so that I decided to upgrade the rear brake on the KTM and change it to a foot brake. Despite the extra weight of the Storm Bee, I actually like having the rear brake up on the handlebar, and I feel that it works really well.
You missed some rocky hill climbs and some rocky descents too. What I should point out about those, not that you necessarily need to see them, but the bike actually did quite a bit better than I was expecting coming down it. It has been very dry here. Woo. It's been very dry here. And we got some torrential downpours. So everything's really eroded. Rocks are exposed. Everything's loose. And yeah, I was expecting to struggle a little bit on the Storm. Not going to lie about that, but it surprised me. Actually did really well. So here's another one right here. This one is traditionally really loose. And this is where that traction control really comes into play. We'll be curious to see how the KTM goes up it, because that was actually way better than I was expecting.
The throttle response on this bike is decent, but when it's ridden back to back with the KTM, it has a bit of a vague feeling. We'll hopefully get some more options to tune this on the production model, but I wish it had some of KTM's rear wheel connectivity. The Storm utilizes a clear and concise battery percentage readout on the display, which I find extremely helpful. On the KTM, you get a color-coded diagram under the seat that you have to cross-reference to the battery display, which might be in my top 5 gripes about the KTM. The build quality of the Storm surprised me in a good way. It feels like a step above the quality of the Light Bee. I still did have some small things break. Specifically, I got a pinch flat in the rear tube, which is when I noticed that this bike is running some pretty thin tubes, a similar trait of the Light Bee. I broke the chain guard. I also lost one of the bolts on the shroud. And I tipped the bike over at one point and broke the brake lever, which is completely my fault and something that can happen on any bike. But just a reminder that a bike of this category and this weight, when ridden off-road, should probably come with some handguards. Another big point for the Storm over the Freeride are the programmable features. Being able to tune regen and traction control have been great on this bike. I'll be honest, I disregarded the traction control option on the Storm until I tested it in some loose, rocky hill climbs. Traction can be fleeting on an electric dirt bike because of all the instantaneous torque. And the traction control setting on the Storm made it easier to put power to the ground instead of lighting the rear wheel up in loose conditions.
Yeah, these types of trails right here, the bike loves this stuff. The suspension is not too maxed out, smooth, flowy, single track. Not so detrimental which line you choose. It's all pretty fast, flowy stuff. Bike feels really good right in here. So I'd say right here, oh God, forgot that corner. I would say like right here and 2-track fire roads, man. That's what the Surron Storm loves. All right, so just getting back on the Surron Storm, and my GPS and everything says I went 16.66 miles on that ride. My current battery percentage is 31% on the Surron Storm. So I was riding it in sport. I would say I was riding about 70% of my capacity when it comes to speed. I was definitely not riding it as hard as I could, and I was trying to be a little bit deliberate with the throttle response. So I'm also going to do that on the KTM Freeride, and just going to hop on that bike right now. All right, startup procedure for the KTM Freeride. You've got your key up here. Turn that on. You wait for this to beep 3 times, and then you have to have your bike set on run. Press the start button. It does that beep, and then you can see the power modes 1, 2, 3. 3 is the fastest, and that is what I'm going to run because I ran the fastest mode on the Surron Storm. So sport mode for the Surron Storm, mode 3 for the KTM Freeride EXC. Very interesting hopping on these 2 bikes back to back. That's really weird, honestly. Oh God, here we go. Oh my God, that is deep. Oh, yikes. I almost went above the seat. Oh man. All right, so let's talk about the first knee-jerk reactions while it's very fresh in my mind. The rider position on these 2 bikes feels so different right off the bat. I feel much further forward on the Freeride. I feel like I'm riding over the front of the bike. The bike just kind of forces you into that position. Pegs feel a lot higher. The bike feels more nimble and lightweight. Does not feel as soft and plush as the Storm. Bike feels a little bit smaller for sure, but the seat height feels taller. It feels so different. Like I said, on the Storm, that bike feels like a kind of mellow dual sport kind of feel. This bike feels a bit more sporty and nimble. So in this stuff, this bike feels way more nimble to come up this stuff. But it still feels like it struggles to get good traction.
I can tell that the KTM is not getting as good of traction as the Storm, and I'm going to chalk that up to the traction control setting on the Storm.
I definitely feel above the bike, which I would say is a good feeling, as opposed to like in the bike.
I feel like the KTM is more of a precision tool. It feels more sporty and more exact. It feels more comfortable to be on the Storm when you're going slow, but as soon as you hit a weird square edge rock or get kicked off of something where you wanted the bike to feel responsive, the KTM feels responsive, whereas the Storm feels vague.
But like I said, I mean, this is another bike where I feel like I don't just hop right on the KTM Freeride EXC and I'm like, oh, I feel right at home. It still takes a little bit of getting used to. Like the ergonomics are a little unusual and weird. Suspension's a little unusual. Whereas I hop on other KTMs like the SX F lineup or my 300 XCW 2-stroke, And I feel so right at home on those bikes. Not because they're gas. I'm speaking strictly chassis here. Like if you could put this power plant into my KTM 300 XCW, oh my God, I would love that bike.
Once again, the suspension has been modified on this specific Freeride, but I've put a lot of hours on the stock Freeride, and I've done so recently, so I can speak to that as well. It doesn't really change my perspective here.
Power, it's a different, I mean, it's like pretty similar power, honestly. This thing feels a little bit spunkier, kind of in that like lower mid to mid-range power. This bike feels like it's got a bit more snap to it, which I like. Obviously, the Storm has more top-end speed, and the throttle feel on the Freeride is definitely better. And I'm not bottoming out there, not to switch topics, but that is the place where I keep bottoming out on the Storm. Didn't even come close on the Freeride. But anyways, let's get back to this throttle point after I do this high-speed section here. Yeah, I could throw this bike around way more, but man, I'm maxed out top speed. I got no more power, where the Storm through that would continue to pull. Oh my God, every time I hit a branch, look guys, if you keep seeing me hit my handguard back, I just broke the zip tie, so every time I hit a branch, it's doing this and then holding my front brake in. So if you see me keep hitting that, that's why. I'll grab a zip tie here in a minute and fix that. But yeah, let's talk about the throttle mapping and throttle feel. Like the KTM feels like it's got more smooth reaction, better response. Right off the crack of the throttle, it feels better. There's not that like...
And you're about to notice a change in audio here. My audio recorder malfunctioned. It must be the day of the technical difficulties. But anyways, reverting back to GoPro audio for the rest of this bit. Sorry for the pause.
More smooth reaction, better response. Right off the crack of the throttle, it feels better. There's not that like lag and delay that you have on the Storm. I just feel more connected to the bike with this throttle than I do on the Storm. Just feel like I can throw the KTM around more and a little more confident with what it's going to do when I throw it around. It's more... A couple of fighter jets. Thought the bike was blowing up on me. That's cool.
In these conditions, in Mode 3, I'm getting a total of roughly 19.75 miles when I'm riding the bike from 100% charge down to 10%. To swap the battery on the KTM, you pull a small lever on the side of the seat to release the seat latch. You then loosen each of the 4 10mm bolts that keep the battery in place and pull the battery out. The battery on the KTM weighs 62 pounds. To swap the battery on the Storm Bee, you've got to remove the seat, release the clasps, disconnect the 2 connection points, and pull the battery out. The battery on the Storm Bee weighs 71 pounds. So, which bike wins the comparison? I'm always down to give you my personal preference, which I will, but let it be known that riders may be looking for different experiences. What suits my riding best may not translate to you. So, I'll break this down. If you're a mellow rider, or you plan on riding 2-track terrain with the occasional romp at higher speeds, then I would suggest you get the Surron Storm. On the other hand, if you're primarily riding single track and you want a more nimble, lighter feeling bike, then I suggest you go with the KTM Freeride. This would be an easier decision if both bikes were exactly the same price, but because the Storm is about $2,800 cheaper than the Freeride, that should also have an impact on your decision. These bikes are not quite apples to apples. I do feel like the KTM is still the superior machine for off-road riding, and it's the bike that I would personally choose. But I primarily ride single track and would naturally go for the racier feeling bike. I think the Storm has a lot of potential, and I plan to see if we can get the F model feeling a bit racier on the trail. One big elephant in the room that I need to point out is that Surron has released the Ultra Bee, which looks like it may fill some of the voids that the Storm Bee currently presents. So, we just might have to put that bike up against the Freeride when the time comes. Until then, thanks for watching.